IleadForPresident.org.
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 IleadForPresident.
And I see Mayor de Blasio in South Carolina announcing his campaign for presidency. I'm here to say, do not vote for Mayor de Blasio. Mayor de Blasio is out of New York. And I'm from New York, right? One of Mayor de Blasio policies was Vision Zero. And it was a policy Vision Zero was a policy not taking into account the so-called African American experience with law enforcement. And a lot of African Americans have was given violations, summonses, and basically it was a free-for-all with law enforcement concerning African Americans because of Mayor de Blasio policy for Vision Zero. I'm all for safety, but safety policies were not taken into context the historical ramifications between law enforcement in North America and the so-called African American experience is very irresponsible. And because of Mayor de Blasio policies concerning Vision Zero, unfortunately, I was one of the people affected by Vision Zero and unlawfully and being discriminated against by law enforcement because of Mayor de Blasio policies with Vision Zero. If you don't know, Vision Zero is basically a policy enforced in New York for motorists to slow down. So basically, if you're in city limits, you got to go 25 miles an hour. But African American communities was given huge amounts of tickets, summonses, infractions by law enforcement because of Mayor de Blasio policies. And Mayor de Blasio didn't take into account the historical discrimination in African American communities, and he just didn't care. So he went about setting policies that gave law enforcement, particularly NYPD, New York City Police Department, the free range to start handing out tickets left and right to these African Americans in African American communities. So I'm at a restaurant and I see Mayor de Blasio come out to announce his campaign for presidency amongst an African American community. I'm saying, hold up. This must be a joke, because when he went about setting his policies for Vision Zero, he didn't take into account the African American communities that was going to be hit the most by NYPD and law enforcement. He just went about setting his policies. So why is you going to announce your presidency campaign in South Carolina, in which my family's from, as if you have some type of loyalty to the African American community, the so-called African American community, when you don't? So I'm here to say, do not vote for Mayor de Blasio. The dude's from out of New York, and so now he got his wife with him, and she must be of so-called African American descent. And that brings me to my second point. While going through my travels in New York and in New Jersey and throughout the tri-state area, I see all these unmarried, beautiful white women. And how do they feel a president parading a black woman, a woman of so-called African American descent, in front of them when they're unmarried? You know, they're beautiful. So Mayor de Blasio don't have loyalty to his own race, right? He don't have loyalty to his own race, so why would he be loyal to America? The so-called African American had experienced an ethnic identity crisis, which we're here to fix. So we don't need somebody trying to lead the country and leading race mixing for political purposes, because that's all it really is. It's a political stunt. And it's obvious when he go to South Carolina to announce his campaign, where his policies in New York don't reflect the African American community at all. But yet he want to parade this so-called African American woman with him, or his wife, when you have all these unmarried, beautiful Caucasian women, and he's not even loyal to his own race. So that's issue two. His policies don't reflect the African American community, which with Vision Zero, and how law enforcement target African American communities because of his policies, and he didn't take us into consideration. So it is very disrespectful to go to African American communities in South Carolina to announce your campaign for presidency, and you don't care about that African American communities. During my campaign for Ali for President 2020, we seeking reparations for the so-called African American for the purpose of genocide and denationalization upon an ethnic group. We also seeking an Aboriginal labor law bill, a labor law obligations that will require at least one Aboriginal worker in the workplace per 5 employees everywhere in the United States. In New York, you could go to diner. You know, there's a lot of beautiful restaurants in New York, which I frequent at. There's no African American employees in there. Why Mayor de Blasio didn't? He's married to a black woman. He's parading a black woman for political purposes in South Carolina amongst black people. Why didn't he address this issue in his own backyard in New York? Why isn't there no African Americans nowhere in Manhattan? Nowhere. You understand what I'm saying? So now I'm at a restaurant where there's no African American workers at, minding my business, and I see Mayor de Blasio announcing his campaign for presidency, and I'm telling you, it's misleading, and we won't stand for it. Do not vote for Mayor de Blasio. He is not our president, and he never will. And I'm very angry at them African Americans in South Carolina who allowed Mayor de Blasio to use them for his political stunts, and they don't reflect the so-called African American community. I say so-called African American community because we know African American is a false term. Our true identity is Aboriginal Americans of Moorish descent. The only way Mayor de Blasio should be even considered is if he stands strong for reparations for the so-called African Americans. And what we mean by reparations, we mean reparations for the so-called African American by giving the Shiamaru tribal government or the Aboriginal Republic of North America, they both interchangeable, reparations. Reparations which will be handed to the institutions of this autonomous nation. Institutions such as the Aboriginal law firm, the Aboriginal Medical Association, the Aboriginal Psychology course. These money will be given to these institutions to help the so-called African American both physically, mentally, and economically, and create a labor force that will propel the so-called African American into the future and beyond. So we're looking for reparations to be handed to the Shiamaru government and be administered through these institutions to develop the best of humanity and bring out the best potential in this ethnic group, the so-called African American, who experienced the worst genocide and denationalization in North America. And also we want politicians to even to be considered. We want an Aboriginal labor law, right? Labor law obligations that require at least one Aboriginal American in the workplace per 5 employees everywhere within the United States. To even be considered as a candidate, that's what we're looking for. Make sure you sign up for our political party. If you are a so-called African American, we are the Indigenous Peoples Political Party.
Go to indigenouspoliticalauthority.org.
The reason why I mentioned under Mayor de Blasio watch in New York City, there's no African American employees in the restaurant business. The reason why I mentioned this is because if you exclude, first of all, restaurants are the social hub of societies. Restaurants, diners, is where people go to eat and socialize and catch up on the latest current event. So if you have no African Americans working in these restaurants, no African Americans are part of your social dynamic, then it's worse than hate. The opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. So if you exclude a whole ethnic group of people from your society, and then you march yourself when you was in a position to lead, all right? Back up. Mayor de Blasio was in a leadership position in New York City, where he could have implemented Aboriginal labor laws that required at least one Aboriginal American in the workplace, at least one so-called African American in the workplace per 5 every employees. All right? If you exclude an entire ethnic group from your social dynamic, I think it's very two-faced and dishonorable to march yourself all the way to South Carolina to launch your campaign for presidency amongst African Americans when your views don't include African American. All right? And that's fine. But just don't be dishonest. So no, we're not voting for Mayor de Blasio, and we don't want African Americans to vote for Mayor de Blasio and his Confederate Party, the Democratic Party. And we want more honest politicians, and we want more laws and politicians that represent the so-called African political dynamic and social dynamic. Stop being dishonest. Say no to Mayor de Blasio.